My guest today is Nancy Kerr. Nancy is a British folk musician, multi-instrumentalist, teacher, academic, singer and activist. She grew up steeped in the British folk tradition. Her mother was a singer, her father was an instrumentalist, and she has many insights to share into this style of music and to its relevance today as she brings it to new audiences through her teaching. We discuss music, political activism, song, and so many other topics. I really hope that you'll enjoy this interview. Unfortunately, there were a few technical problems with my equipment during the making, so I do apologise if that causes you any distraction. Enjoy the interview. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, thank you.
Nancy, I wanted to talk to you for a long time because I've followed your work and I really love what you do, and I hope that you will be able to provide me some of the things that I've been longing to
Oh, yes.
longing to ask about. First of all, you've spent the whole month of May doing a series of daily recordings of Leon Rosselson's songs. Why Leon? Was it just a sort of thing that you needed to do something in lockdown, or was there a particular reason?
Yeah, a bit of that. I mean, I certainly don't know many sort of musicians who are very good at, not playing or, sitting still. So there was definitely a bit of that sort of let's flex my muscles. I wanted to get better at playing the guitar because I play guitar, but I don't really identify as a guitarist. So I thought that this might challenge me in that. But why Leon? Leon is, I was literally just thinking about it and reflecting because the month's coming to an end, Leon is the kind of constant soundtrack through my childhood and growing up in Britain, during the 70s, the 80s, the Cold War, the collapse of communism, he's not just a set of brilliant songs. They are that, but they're also a bit of a map for me. And I know other, friends of my sort of generation, the sort of second generation political folkies. Leon is he's kind of our musical ethical map, really. So it has been like wallowing in the sounds of my childhood, and not in a completely warm and fluffy way, because some of his stuff's very dark, which is part of it, isn't it? It's part of that ability that music has to do the light and the dark all wrapped up together. They're my main reasons, really. It's something to flex my musical muscles a bit, but also I couldn't have done it. I don't think there's one other writer I could have done it with, maybe my mum, but that's about it, because Leon's songs are in the bone for me because of that. When you learn things in childhood, especially if they're set to music, you kind of learn them forever, don't you?
That's right, yeah.
So
you said that your mother had sung some of these songs. So that was your route into folk music, or was it you discovered it independently?
I think, well, it was definitely my route in, but I stayed independently, but I was in it because of family. Yeah, Mum's a singer and writer and still going strong, and my dad was an instrumentalist, so it was it was that kind of, picture a musical folk family, and it was that, really, I have to say. But I don't think I would have stayed if I hadn't fallen really hard in love with things like Leon's writing, with things like the big ballads, because of their magic and their darkness and their bloodiness as well. I think that sort of, frankly, that grabbed me as a sort of teenage goth in the way that I didn't have a choice about the music that was there as a young child. So definitely, Mum's a big part of it. And some of the songs I've sung I know because she sung them, of Leon's. They're friends. I was brought up a bit of my childhood in North London, which is where Leon's based. So he was kind of part of the same political folk picture as my mum Sandra.
Yeah, you teach now as well, and is that something that's informed your teaching? Is that why because you teach traditional music and songwriting, right?
Yeah, I teach. Most people I know, we kind of imbibe the folk and the music and stuff, but it's kind of assumed that we all transmit as well. So but that's how I feel about it. I tell you, one thing that's been great about lockdown is all of these people suddenly going, "Oh, I'll teach. There's no gigs. I'll teach." And suddenly I feel like teaching's really, really valued in a way that, before it was a bit like not as glamorous maybe, but now it's like...
Yeah, I think it was always seen as, well, that's the kind of thing you have to do to make a living when you're not able to gig and make enough money.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, and maybe that is part of it. It's certainly been because I was brought up mostly by my mum, and she always taught as well. So, and partly because she'd spent her youth learning from Ewan McColl and Peggy Seeger, and the transmission of all of that was completely built in. So in some ways, analysing traditional music and folk music, etc., was part of the whole picture of the practice, and that's what I inherited from mum. You know, and also getting to what you were saying about you know, it being a good pathway apart from gigging. It absolutely, well, most of the musicians that I know, we are prepared to wear lots of hats, and that was mum's thing. You know, the portfolio career, if you like, was the centre of it. But yes, that's a long way of saying, yeah, I do teach, and I'm really interested in teaching under the kind of higher education umbrella. That's sort of where I live at the moment. So I'm about to have, our first cohort of graduates from the first conservatoire folk degree course in England. So that's at Leeds College of Music. And that's a huge part of my life. I spend most of my time now, I think, thinking about the methodology of teaching what I do rather than performing it, and it's been like that for a while now. So yeah, teaching's central to me. I love it, and it takes up a lot of my brain.
Yeah. So you mentioned the political scene, and the, you know, I think many of the people in the folk scene probably share fairly left-leaning views, let's say. Is it something that you've particularly helped, you know, sort of sort out the particular songs that fit that? Because one thing I've really noticed, and I've talked to other people about this, that, you know, it's a bit of a weird thing, because on one hand, the audiences who go to folk festivals tend to be quite conservative leaning, and all of the folkies that I know are real hardcore socialists.
I know. So. Do you think we're their gateway drug into the left? Do you think that's what we are as the practitioners? We kind of make it okay, because there is that as well, isn't there? That's kind of like you can smuggle a lot of sort of message in there. I mean, you can be your full-on political folk singer and all that, which is obviously where lots of us live, but it's not what I've ever done. So I do sometimes feel like I'm just trying to make, like almost sort of find that thread of my belief system in the tradition. Because if I want to write it, I'll just write it. Yeah, but when it comes to choosing those old songs, it's one of the things my students articulate really well, especially the ones in their sort of late teens, early 20s. They articulate this really great sort of double think or slight cognitive dissonance, which is that play of wanting to change the world against traditionalism, like traditional songs. And there is like there's some quite reactionary stuff bound up in songs that we might choose to ditch or to rework, or, you know, and my students have this very fluent language of how to manage that, but it does make us giggle, because it's like having a foot in two different worlds sometimes. And I have to say, personally, I don't know how many people share this, but I do still feel that I have to defend those ideologies. You know what I mean? I am fearful of maybe sometimes being a little bit too on the nose. So I think I probably am more subtle and smuggle things in with my music than other singers. That's why it's been so lovely to sing Leon's songs, because they are so categorically what they are. They come from somewhere so authentically obvious and politically inspired. Like I just did his Song of the Old Communist, and it's flawless because it's this beautiful narrative. It's a confessional really about a man who is working class, poor, finds out what's happening in Soviet Russia and goes, actually that sounds like a really great idea. Right. Then of course has his sort of heart all but broken, but the hope is still there. And to me that's genius, because it takes a narrative that you can't argue with, because it's people I know, that is their story. So it's much, you know, I think maybe that personal, I think one of the things second wave feminism probably really won at was getting that personal political thing sorted, where it's okay to talk about my story and that's still really valid, and that love songs are valid, and songs about ordinary people, because they amplify those marginalised voices, are a political act. So I'm okay with it, but I know we do sort of, don't we? We try and make it sort of fit in our minds where we're at and what our audience might be able to deal with.
Yeah. I think there's also a bit of a struggle. I was talking with Piers Corley for one of these interviews, and we discussed the fact that many of the traditional ballads are absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
And from a patriarchal point of view, and also from a political view, and many of them were about, essentially feudalism and lords taking advantage of young maids and leaving them on the doorstep. So how have you squared that, or is that something you've tried to work into, like adjusting them? Because Pierre said he basically rewrote some, and I've done the same.
Yeah. I mean, so a couple of things. I mean, I'm actually all right with the ones that are really clear. What I struggle with are the ones where things like lack of consent, or like, actually quite rape adjacent narratives are slid under the kind of cover of a pretty tune or of seduction. So and again, that's part of this really interesting dialogue I have, especially but not exclusively with my female traditional song students. But we're like, what is happening here, and what am I importing with this narrative? And I think one of the things I love about ballads, the old ballads, not so much the broadsides, but those kind of ones that are played around with and just kind of hang on as these archetypal sort of vestiges we can't get rid of. What I love about them is actually the weird, not lack of moralizing, but the way that the moral is kind of in there for you to look at and find, but it doesn't play it out for you. So they very rarely do that thing of going, well, if he hadn't done that, she wouldn't have done that, and none of this would have happened. There you go, learn from that. They do something much more, which is going, this is the story, do it, work with it. It lands in your lap, it lands in your ear. And so I think that, exactly what you say, that decision of whether to rewrite, whether to go with it, warts and all, but then maybe package something in your introduction to it saying, actually, I think this is a bit on the nose. Why don't you hear it like that? I've got songs that I've now sung for so long that I will be inside them as I'm singing them, and I'll see something different in them, and it just skews the whole thing. Like the Great Silky of Soul Skerry is one where when I was growing up, that was just a lovely song about a magical creature that comes out the sea, but it's got these layers of sexuality and consent and sort of mismanagement of kind of family dynamics. It's different depending on who you are in that moment when you listen to it. I think in some ways it's a bit of it's not my natural area, but it's a bit of a leap of faith, isn't it? That you tell these stories and that you do what Mum was taught to do actually by Ewan McCall, that idea of sort of placing yourself, that sort of Stanislavskian thing of placing yourself in those narratives and working out, who am I? What is this saying? Where am I going to get the information that informs how I sing it? And, I think that's what ballad singers do anyway. I think that in lots of different ways and different ways of kind of drawing it out and different levels of consciousness, I think that's what we do, and that's their magic. So, it's such an interesting thing, isn't it? What we choose to leave in and choose to leave out and choose to read in them. They're fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. And I think the also the interesting thing to see is, the development in sort of my lifetime. I'm probably a bit older than you, but we, sort of growing up as a child in the 70s and hearing some of that folk revival stuff that was about, and the changes in the way that things are performed, the way that things are done, the way that things are talked about, the kind of the bawdiness has gone a little bit, and more of the information about the political scene and the background and all that, and that's really interesting to me. To hear that and to see that. It has changed, hasn't it? There has been shifts even in the last 10-15 years, I think. I mean, I remember a group in Sheffield they're still around, but Diverse Traditional Songs Project, which was the first time I really heard people talking about gender expression and how we might actually look at singing songs about who we really are rather than these very kind of binary, very gender coded narratives. And that seemed like a kind of boom to me at the time. And now I feel like it's much more of a kind of current dialogue, which is, cool. It's really cool. And I do like that, actually. It's actually quite, in some cases, it's quite simple to rewrite these things, but literally by changing a pronoun into a song that could be equally about, same-sex relationship, and that
Absolutely.
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
You set me up very nicely for a question, because one of my favorite songs of yours, and actually one of my absolute favorite songs from the last few years, actually, that I discovered, is a song you wrote called "Fragile Water."
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful line in it. Well, there's many beautiful lines, but there's a beautiful line that says, "My little fish, slip off your skin and leave it in the tide for gulls to plunder." And when I first heard that, it just spoke to me of this just inspiring freedom, like the idea that you can just ditch all of the things that people put on you and see you as, and just be you, and let everyone else deal with that wreckage of, and you be free and swim. Is that something that really informed that, or am I just projecting onto that?
You're right. And actually, wreckage is a really great word for it, because actually I'm really conscious that leaving the skin for the gulls to plunder, there's a sort of, for me, that was a sort of acknowledgement of the sort of grieving and the messiness of it as well, because that's always those legends where people shapeshift and leave their skins and stuff. I'm always like wondering, one of the reasons I love the Selkie one so much is it is about the skin. It's about whether she can find her skin, put it on and go to where she's meant to be. And it's very tactile. It's not quite the sort of werewolf who's like suddenly all sleek and then suddenly all sexy. It's like, it's quite quite visceral, I suppose. So I was very conscious that I also, my reasoning for writing the song, although it didn't come out exactly, but it kind of frames that little section you've said, is I was thinking of it in terms of a parent giving the acknowledgement of that, of going, I made this skin, but it's not what you want, so stuff it. It's that, it's what we want to hear. And I think it's what we want to be as parents as well. It's certainly what I would want to be. I was actually looking at my little boy eating some salmon. He really likes fish. He's basically an otter. And he had some shiny salmon skin in his hand. And I just thought, what a great image, for like, just swim, just be what you want to do, and I will deal with it, so that was my thinking. So I think you've definitely,
and that is what you want for your children, isn't it? My children are quite grown up now, but they're full adults, but that idea that if you wish to if you wish to walk or swim, that let there be nothing in the world to hinder. And that's just that's exactly what you want, isn't it? You want to set them up and say, it's you be you, and I'll support you and I'll love you, and be like that. Exactly. And I wonder, actually, talking about that, songs about things like selkies and shapeshifters and all those kind of things. Maybe I'm looking at it with 21st century eyes, but I do wonder if those are kind of hidden, coded ways of talking about transgender issues and that kind of thing.
That was my thought. It didn't come out of the blue. I'm pretty, I know people have been talking about that idea. I remember going to Milltown Malbay when I was 14. I went to the Willie Clancy Traditional Music Week. And I remember going to all of these singing sessions where men were singing songs. It's what you said before about pronouns. They were singing these incredibly beautiful songs from the women's perspective. And there I am at 14 going, that's really interesting, because you're singing about men and you're singing very romantically about men. And at that point, I kind of did go, maybe there is that sort of, there's codedness in other ways. So I don't see why there shouldn't be codedness in that way, One of the ones I draw on lots is Renadine, which is about a sort of unquantifiably predatory creature, but we never quite know, apart from the foxiness of the name. It's just really open, isn't it? And yet there's stuff we know we're receiving a warning, but we know we're also getting an acknowledgement of seduction or seductiveness or temptation,
like a sly seduction.
Exactly. That's the thing. He's sly and he glints and she wants to go with him. And so I think we can deal, can't we, at some level, with all of those complex codedness sort of songs. So why not? But I'm a fan of the 21st Century Eyes, but then I think that's because I'm not an archivist, I'm a singer. And I think that I would, for example, I think I read the beginning, I haven't finished it yet, but read Steve Roud's, folk song in England, and was very struck by the fact that this thing I treat as something fluid and something for me to rip into and tell my stories with is actually something that does have concrete boundaries to it. Do you know what I mean? Like, there is a song that comes from that time, someone sang it, it went like that. And I think that my urge as an artist is to not acknowledge that as much as I would have maybe if I'd stayed as a traditional singer. But I think as the point came where I was adapting things and writing, which is what all those revivalists did, Carthy,
exactly.
you know, Nick Jones, it's all shaped.
Yes.
And then we treat those like canon, but they're recently reshaped.
Yeah.
So,
and I think the collectors also reshaped them. You know, there's a book of Scottish songs, Peter Buchan's book.
Right.
And I was talking to Iona Fife about this, you know, because there's a song in there, Come Away From My Window, and he's made it his version of it is very much probably about a sexual relationship, whereas her understanding and her version that was taught to her by Stanley Robinson was about a crime that's been committed, and that you know, that the girl is in trouble because they've pulled her into this crime. Yeah. So, you know, and one of the things that I was reading an article about is that the way that the collectors they either sanitized things or put their own slant on things. Yeah. A bit like when the first explorers hit Antarctica and discovered the absolutely terrible things penguins did to each other, and they're completely whitewashed.
Oh, I love it. I love the penguin metaphor. Love it. Brilliant. But yeah, that's it. I've got a thing, this is unfounded except for just sort of anecdotally and looking at music and looking at how things work, but I've got this feeling as well that things like, say, Cecil Sharp going in, as he did brilliantly, stepping across sort of class boundaries, social boundaries, and even gender boundaries, you know, finding himself among women. Or, you know, those singers up in, when they're doing the stretching the cloth, the walking songs, you know, that idea that there's that bawdiness. There's that gorgeous piece of film of, I think it's Ali Bain in there with these, or is it Phil Cunningham? Can't remember. And he's watching the women singing these beautiful and they're, you know, gorgeous work songs, but they're quite edgy, quite filthy, and quite on the edge and improvised. And so I think there is something about that. I know for me it's imagined, but that imagined sort of gender safe space that's like women sewing in their cottage or something like that, and all together. And I feel like the music that was there, for example, we're probably never gonna hear, because that wasn't what was going to be furnished to the collectors because of society. Yeah. So I sometimes feel like we're trying to put that spark back, even if it was maybe not there. Do you know what I mean? I think I'm trying to put that, and it is that sort of anarchic quality, isn't it, that we tend to fall in love with about the folk songs. So I think that's why I'm now okay with playing fast and loose with the tradition, or just writing a new song, you know, just going with it. I feel like I've made peace with that, whereas I wouldn't have when I was a young singer. I was very pure about, this is how a song goes, and I'm not going to make it poppy, and I'm not going to do this. And now I don't care at all. I think it's had that lovely Martin Carthy thing proved, which is that the worst thing you do is not sing them, you know, and that they can survive the stretchiness of it.
I think we forget what they were for. They were for telling stories to each other, you know. And now we're in the 21st century and we're telling each other stories the same way, but they're different stories, you know, and they have to be different stories because, you know, we don't all live on farms in the middle of, in the middle of nowhere. That's right. With only a very small village of people around us, and you know, hearing about the man in, you know, the fair swain in the next village that, you know, when you live at a distance, you've got to go on a cart. It's just not like that anymore. You know, you can fly to California and meet your other half. So
that's right. Yeah, you're right. You've hit the nail on the head there. That's exactly it. And actually, we should, as folkies or whatever we are, we should be able to kind of make sense of that and internalize it, because actually we do talk about function all the time. We are the last people to do art for art's sake, and I think it's one of our flaws actually as a genre or a movement or whatever we are. I think we do forget that it's just sometimes about singing, but we're very keen to go, well, this is a work song or this is a warning song, and do you know what I mean, because the function is so in the material, which is gorgeous. Again, it's why we love it. But you're so right, and it's one of the things that I teach really strongly, you know, is the idea that it's not just a set of notes, it's a set of notes that behaves like that because of what it did, or a set of words that's being put like that because that person needed that. But I do remember my first year of students at Leeds College of Music, you know, we do quite a lot on political song and what political movements have birthed in terms of song. We spend a lot of time on the civil rights movement, a lot of time on peace songs, etc., and industrial revolution. And we talked about this, and we're talking about function, and I'm going, look, do remember the songs have these feelings in them, they have these pentatonic scales because they work, you know, all of this. But at the end of it, one of my students just went, is it not just about being together and singing, though? And I was like, of course it is. I'm so pleased to hear you say that, because I think it is easy to, as you say, overanalyze and remember.
You know, I often think of it as being like church for ordinary people, you know, because in the past, in the days in old England, you know, church was for the gentry, and you know, and the maids and everyone else, you know, had to sit in the back and be quiet and shut up, and but they would sing while they were peeling the carrots and getting the milk and all that kind of thing, or you know, the men would sing when they're chopping the wood. And so I feel like it's song for ordinary people, and that's what I think touches me about it is that these are stories of normal people, you know, and when the landed gentry are in there, they're not necessarily depicted in the best light.
No, they don't look great. There's also that lovely kind of fluid use of some bits of language where someone will be described as a queen, but it's not that they're royal, it's just that they're this fabulous woman, you know. And I love it now that like millennials will say, oh, she's my queen, and that always makes me think of like, she looked to me like the Queen of May or something like that. Do you know what I mean? It's not like there's this kind of woke set of languages now, but they're not a million miles away from the way, exactly as you say, the ordinary people take the language and make it mean what they want to mean. But I love what you say about religion as well. I think John Bowden's got quite a lot of that, hasn't he, about the kind of ritualistic replacement of, yes, as you say, worship. And the faith system that goes with that isn't there, but there is something there, isn't there? There's something about the tangibility and the untangibility of it that really does, I think, fill that gap. It certainly does me. I've never felt that kind of big yawning chasm of, oh, I don't have religion, because I've had folk song. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I really do feel that.
To me, the best songs are about reality, even if it's not truth and fact, let's say, it's real. Yeah. And that, so I was going to ask you, when you write, do you think about it in terms of writing it like a folk song, or are you're trying to put a particular way of writing into it, or a genre?
The structure is everything for me. I know that's not the same for everyone, but the idea of being able to see a folk song as not its language so much, because I do try not to write too archaically, although I don't have a problem with it, but I do like everyday language from our time. So or at least trying to find a balance between being up to date but being kind of timeless. So not to do with the language, but to do with things like the meter and the structure. I absolutely use folk song types as my frameworks for that, because they've just been around so long, and also, you know, and so you want the song to have that archetypal sort of weight and significance. But you know, that's not exclusive to folk song. When I trained as a music therapist, and when I was training, it wasn't really, now there's quite a lot of people from sort of vernacular music forms and world music in that, and it's very radical, but when I was training, it was still quite sort of classical in terms of what you came from and how you kind of worked out what you were going to do, or you know, and jazz and stuff. But really the idea of using folk in those settings was a bit new. And then for it was one of my last sort of sets of lectures I had before I qualified. They got a songwriting tutor in. I wish I knew who it was. But they got a songwriting tutor in, and he was a pop songwriter, but he worked a lot in some of the areas where they do use a lot of songwriting in music therapy, like palliative care and dementia care and stuff. And he took us through all these lectures on and kind of frameworks of how to create songwriting in healthcare situations, which is something I still, you know, do and think about a lot and teach. And the last thing he said, his parting shot was, by the way, if you want a really quick way of getting this going, look for your folk traditions. Look at them, because they're there and they've lasted, and those are the shapes that you can pluck out of the air and have a song for someone. And that, it really meant a lot to me, because I hadn't really heard my music really acknowledged in terms of that. You know what I mean? I still felt like folk was kind of a poor cousin, which I think it was at that point. And I think, again, that's changed in the media and in people's perception. I think people now, maybe we have to thank the Tories, because I think all arts are under attack, you know, so we're all in it together. But, you know, it used to be you'd have to fight your corner and go, no, folk is good. It's good. We're good at what we do. And it's learned and it's beautiful. And anyway, so that's a long way of saying that those shapes are there for a reason. No one owns them. We can all have a go. We can all write a song. You know, what an amazing democratic, brilliant thing. You know, write a shanty. You only need 2 lines, probably. And chances are, once you've uncorked it as well as a writer, you tend to keep going, don't you? Like, I think it's often just that blank, I've got to start a song thing. And a folk structure, like a call and response or something, just, for me, it just uncorks and gets rid of the blank page, and then you're off. You know, you might not love it when you've finished it, but you've written something. So I think they're brilliant. I just think it's such a wellspring, and there's a downside to no one owning them, because we don't know who those ordinary brilliant people were who came up with them and, you know, kept them going. But now we're those people, so I guess it's a full circle, you know.
I think it's good to use these forms and to keep these forms and push them forward. I mean, I think when I look at the kind of modern folk scene, you know, I really see some great things about people doing things with it that kind of updates them. You can look at Jim Moray or someone like that, who's really using kind of modern production techniques and electronica and so on. And I think that's just fantastic, you know.
I do too. Sweet England and Martin Bennett's Grit were 2 albums that I just think changed everything. And I don't think we realised at the time how they changed everything, although we should have guessed that it ruffled feathers, because that's always a good sign, isn't it? But those 2, I remember playing Grit again to my mum, you know, and mum's a traditional singer, and she knew a lot of those traditional Scots singers who were in Martin Bennett's pieces, you know, and she just loved them. And again, one of my students said to me, you know, if it weren't for Jim, this is something I always forget, and it's a bit like a check your privilege thing, isn't it? Because of course I've got all these lovely folk books here, you know, I can go and find a folk song and I don't even think about it. And that was there before the internet was, you know, before there was the full English and everything going off, you know, and being all very much more democratic. When you had to go and find something in Cecil Sharp House in London to find a song, I had a nice library and I had access to folk song, but that isn't true for many people. And some of my students have gone, do you know what, if I'd never heard Grit or if I'd never heard Sweet England, I wouldn't have heard those songs. And it's because they had that up to the minute production, as you say, and that packaging of like, look, old new music or new old music. I think they're great. I get more fond of that stuff as it goes. I love everything Jim does, but I particularly like Sweet England. Just
it's a
clever
brilliant
stuff.
Album.
Yeah.
You were mentioning earlier about the language, and this is one thing that I really like about the traditional folk, is that my mum's a linguist, so I'm kind of geeky about this stuff anyway. But you kind of see this development of language over time, and you know, figure out old words. You know, if you go and look at some of the stuff that dates back to the 16th century, obviously the wording and the meanings are really, really different. And it's nice I think it's really nice to try to work that way in my own work, in writing things that would fit the language of now, but in a way that it's spoken, in a way that it's thought about now, in the way that the language used. So it's kind of can be idiomatic, which has a danger of dating it, but I still think it's good to put your music in a place of and a sense of time.
That's really interesting, because I think that is a lot of what we do. Scansion's really important to me as well, that because it's oral, because I don't even actually read brilliantly, like I don't read music brilliantly, and if I have to read words, all I can think of is that I can't wait until I've learnt this so I don't have to look at these anymore. So I think I definitely live in that ear place, which means that the words have to be words. They can't just look nice on a page. So I think it's that as well, isn't it? That sort of living in the oral kind of space. Yeah, I think with me, I've never really felt I live quite in the right time anyway. So I don't want to feel like a 16th century sort of minstrel, but I also don't feel particularly, well, I certainly didn't feel 20th century.
Right.
I don't know,
Right.
but jury's out on the new one. But I think that means I'm doing a similar thing to you. I'm just trying to find a middle ground where, to me, I use the word vernacular a lot, and I think it's a really important word because it is about reality and, as you say, coming out of the mouths of people, but it's also something that has a continuum. So I have more in common with someone else who maybe didn't read music really great or didn't leave school in a blinding flash of brilliance from the 16th century, than someone who went to Eton now. I think that's got that. There's a linguistic part to that, to the sort of living in the vernacular thing. But how you put it in songs it feels a bit endless, the possibilities, doesn't it?
Yeah. I actually think, I haven't really put any academic work into this, so take your teacher hat off for a minute. But I actually think that for me, one of the things was that when I first heard folk music, it was the first time I'd heard style of singing with accents, with a regional accent, with my own people who now I've lost my accent as I've got older because I've lived so many different places. But growing up, I didn't hear people with my accents on TV. Yeah. But I heard them in song. Yeah. And I think that this is something that has also translated. I lived in America for many years. Right. And listening to rap music, it's very much American folk music of today. Yeah. And the beats and the feel and all of those things are they have this continuum back to old Delta blues and before that to African rhythms. Yeah. But they have this use of modern vernacular where they're not singing in a very formal let's say received pronunciation way that we would have seen on the TV growing up or hearing in song in church or in classical music, but really the accents that they have, and you can identify, they're from New York, they're from Boston, they're from LA. Right. Yeah. But what I wanted to say on a slightly tangential way is that I think that using the language that you live in and using the cultural reference that you have, I think is super important to making a song worth something to someone, and the feeling, even if it's that you're inhabiting a similar emotional space, I think that's really what makes a difference. What's your take on that?
I wonder if that's one of the reasons that made me feel a bit like it made me think of the way that people I don't know, that way that people on the folk scene, we have a bit of a bad habit of sort of talking ourselves out of doing what we do. This idea that we might actually be a bit too middle class and a bit too privileged to sing any of this music. And I'm wondering whether that sort of deep understanding that we should just be who we are, I wonder if that's part of that, like feeling a bit rootless and a bit like you don't maybe belong to a really solid sort of class identity, or maybe being a bit iffy about national identities and stuff like that. I wonder if that's one of the reasons that people go, oh, should we, why that dialogue keeps coming up of, well, you're not a ploughman, are you? So why don't you just shut up, But yeah, I think that's really great. Yeah. I love the idea of a common melting pot kind of coming from I don't think we... well, maybe I haven't before is a better way of thinking about it. I don't think I've acknowledged American music generally in terms of having a shaping influence on what I do, and actually, frankly, on English music. Everyone talks about it the other way around. It's so colonial, isn't it? It's such a colonised view of folk, the kind of Cecil Sharp, Maud Carpelle's thing of, let's go and follow the Scottish to where they went. And that's like this part is a tiny part of the picture of what was happening in America and what we've inherited from that. So that totally fits to me. as well. And I think there's just that weird polarization. You say, you know, Delta blues and African American music and the banjo, and just I'll tell you, like that flighting thing where where you battle basically in language and poetry off the mark, all comes from there, or is all found there. But then we've done this weird. Is it the music industry? I don't know. Why do we put these weird sort of boundaries? Because you heard before, I'm very careful about even saying folk is a genre. I'm not even sure it has. Yeah. I'm not even sure I believe in genre, but I know it's useful, but it doesn't say the right thing for me.
I don't think it has any meaning in terms of how we feel or think about it.
Yeah.
It has usefulness, I think, in trying to make it available to other people, and certainly in journalism. You know, if someone's going to write about you, that they're probably not going to put me in an EDM dance magazine, because I'm just not relevant to that audience.
Yeah.
As much as I'm relevant to any audience, but that's just as far, for me, that's as far as it goes. I think it's very, very flexible, and I think it's undeniable that the influence of American art and American music, which comes very, very much from the African tradition of music. Songs that were sung by workers in the fields while they were working, picking cotton, cutting sugar, chopping wood, whatever it was. It's the same thing. It's the same songs that we and the stories of our culture and the things that we tell each other.
Yeah.
This reminds me, just it's a bit of a jump, but I wanted to talk a bit about a song that you wrote called Gingerbread. And in that song, for me, it seems to be about mourning and about comfort and about grief and perhaps reflections on death. But there's also a parallel that you make. I'll read the last verse if that's okay. While the black sky spreads its myth of thunder that we labour under, reckoned by the dead, these are crude thanks, charity and food banks for our harvest splendor, pepper for our bread. Can you talk a little bit about that verse?
Yeah, so I think I've honestly never teased this out in actual grown-up words before. It's all been a kind of feeling. But I think that what I'm responding to there is this something that I think is in a lot of our work. Chris Wood certainly talks probably much better than I can about it. But this idea of the fact of the enclosures and the sort of divorcement of my people, who are people who have to work for a living because there's no other option, the kind of disenfranchisement of that idea and that people from land. I think it's something about that, and it's not that I wanted to. I mean, I do. I think that treatment of working people in this time and country is appalling, and I think we're probably in one of the darkest, most overtly kind of elitist points in history that I've seen, and I'm talking about the last few weeks actually. So I think there's that, if you knowing what you know about where I come from and my work, that's layered into it, isn't it? I can't escape from that. I can't ever forget the fact that I grew up singing in 1649 to St George's Hill. The world turned upside down, and those stories of the diggers and Abbey as a cop, and those histories of defiance, which are about not being able to grow your own dinner, or at least not even being able to get a decent, price for your own dinner. So I think it's just for me, that line was to knit together poverty now and poverty then, I suppose. Yeah. And it was this, so the gingerbread thing was that this friend of mine, Lucy, who deals with, she does a lot in women's, again, like women's kind of lived history, ordinary women and their extraordinary history. But she also does recipes from kind of lost in history, people's recipes from history. And that's a medieval gingerbread recipe with no ginger in it. So the whole thing is like a metaphor for making do. It's like I've been kind of really interested in... it's a bit of a leap, but I got really into preppers and like doomsday preppers and things. Because I know it's dark times, but
they're fascinating people.
But really fascinating. But and I wrote a song at the beginning of lockdown which was called Mama Was a Prepper After All, because all I could think about was actually all of our mums, well, my family, that was just how you behaved. You behaved like something really bad was going to happen, and you made the best of it, but you did stockpile and you did scrimp. And it's not that you're it's not the ant and the grasshopper, it's not that you think that's the moral thing to do, it's that you've lived through really shit things.
Yeah.
So, and I sometimes think that we forget that. I think we might forget that folk music still has a resonance because people are still having a really bad time, that it's not just some nice academic thing we do because we, that we feel it. I think I'm definitely in that because that was my granny's life or my mum's life. So, so I think Gingerbread started as a song about love and death and those cycles. I wrote a lot of it on a train through some very, very black, wet fields. It looked like it had been a really grim harvest, actually. I think it was a few years ago when it had really, really rained, and I just thought, I don't see how anything good is coming out of this harvest. Yeah. A couple of years later, it was too hot for there to be a harvest. I think the harvest was down masses a couple of years ago, like really, really decimated. So it was that kind of responding to what I was seeing around me. I'm not a farmer, but I have worked on farms and things, and I think that that's a nice thing to try and express because it's archetypal. Even if the greenery that we're seeing or the harvest that we're seeing is whether they're cutting the trees down at the park or whether the grass is bleached on the football pitch or whatever, or bits of stuff growing up between the cracks. I always talk about that. Like, I live in the inner city. I'm not seeing a lot of green right now out of my garden, out of my window. But I've got my garden and which is an amazing privilege. So I get a lot of kind of outdoor stuff, all that stuff about as the birds are leaving and the flowers seeding, flowers kind of giving up their last little burst before it's all over. That's all just from sitting in the garden looking around me. But other than that, really, I live in a place where nature is coming up through concrete. And that's every single one of my songs. I kind of want to have that sense in it because I think that's probably what most of us are now seeing. To me, that I can't put that in and it's Leon Russelson's fault as well. I have to. It's Barney's Epic Homer. That kind of pastoral idyll that we hear in folk song. That's not where I live, so I can only deal with it for a little while, and then I have to get back to the concrete. So Gingerbread's that was a very long, not very answering your question answer, but Gingerbread definitely fits into that, and yet it could just be a love song. Do you know what I mean? Which World Turned Upside Down is not. That's a political narrative, brilliant historical song. But I think I was conscious in Gingerbread of kind of hiding it a little bit under something more personal. So
I like the fact that you can always make multiple interpretations, and I'm always having just asked you to explain your song, I'm always a little bit reluctant to try to dig too deep and because I don't always know what the lyrics mean.
Yes, that's right, and that can be fascinating, can't it? That can be really I remember childhood and mysteries of like, what does that, I just back when you only have like the vinyl and there might be some information on it, but you couldn't go and like just look up loads of stuff about someone's songs. So I just had, you'd look, wouldn't you, at the cover of the album, the sleeve, and just try and get as much as you could, but it still would very rarely answer those deep questions of what that lyric might mean or what that might allude to. So the mystery was sort of almost more, it's a bit kind of cargo cult, really. You kind of make your own thing, don't you?
Yeah. And I think even with with my own songs, sometimes I just, years later, I'll think of a line and I think, oh, actually, that's what that meant.
Yes,
and I didn't have any idea at the time when I wrote it, but that's really what it meant.
Exactly. I love that as well, because so often I think I'm trying to replicate something that actually I'm not seeing in words, I'm seeing an image. And that Gingerbread actually originally had a whole section in it that was about hunting, and it was much more overtly about the sort of the chase, and it was much more more bloody. It was a bit more the sort of red and tooth and claw. And actually I think I ended up using some of those bits of the song. It got cut, and I think I used those in another song which is Written on My Skin. I think that's where I got Written on My Skin from, which is completely metaphorical. It's about sexual assault. It's about a very specific kind of moment in history of women, particularly women's kind of experience. But I did it with just with this image that I couldn't get rid of because I'd had it in Gingerbread, but I didn't know why it was there, and it wasn't probably there for that song. It was there for a later song. But it all comes from the same thing. It all comes from ordinary people looking around them and trying to make sense of the world, whether it's a fox hunt in the 19th century or a fox trotting past my front door in the inner city. It's that kind of responding to the image for me anyway.
You talked about women's experience, and I was thinking about this, that actually in if you look at the forms of music that are very popular in Britain, certainly when I was growing up, it was all classic rock and heavy metal and big macho, guys with big hair, and then of course it was pop, which also many of the big acts were men. And although now that's definitely changed, and I think if you look in pop as a genre, there's more women. But one of the things that I think about folk is that there always have been more women kind of at the top of the game. But as a woman and as a performer in that, how far do we still have to go? Yeah,
you're right though. It's very nice to hear it put that positively, because I always saw women doing what I wanted to do. The reason I continued to play fiddle is because I saw female fiddle players who blew my mind, and I loved them, and I could see myself. So it's that modelling things, and it's that role model. And what you say about pop and rock, I don't even know if it was about the sort of numbers of each thing, because I still think we need more women. We need to put more women on our posters. Even if women are playing at festivals, they don't seem to make it onto the poster sometimes, or like the first kind of come and buy your early bird tickets, these people are playing, they always seem to be blokes, and then later you'll find there are actually some women. Anyway, not all festivals, obviously some of them are fantastic, but that's an area we could work on. It's really white as well, like again that kind of weird polarization of like white people do folk music it just doesn't make any sense to me. So there's stuff, but I think going back to what you were saying about other genres and what I was seeing when I was growing up, and those musics were there, it wasn't that I didn't like the music or that I didn't see my gender there, but when I did see my gender there, it was all about being very pretty, very thin, and very young. And folk music was not doing that. So it's as much about how women are as obviously more would always be great, because you don't see how women are unless you see women. But I was literally thinking about this morning of that, watching some of the music that my kids are into and going, because I loved it. I loved metal particularly. And also I think there's that really strong punk folk kind of parallel. And of course in punk, the women, when you can find them, were doing something not dissimilar. They were being physically what most of us are, which is a lot of different things, very diverse, and sometimes really awkward. And what I didn't see among women in pop was awkwardness, actually. Plenty of awkward men, lovely, great, but in terms of being a bit out of your place and out of your zone, I never saw that in pop, and that's capitalism. That's, as far as I'm concerned, that's just trying to sell stuff. And because folk really had that slight, I think folk had a bit of a privilege actually being out of the mainstream for a while, because we didn't have to dally with that. We didn't have to sell it with prettiness. So that's my thought. I think we just need people of all genders actually who are able to behave how they are and to show what they are, and to give especially young people an option to see their reflection. It's just that, isn't it? It's the same as colour, people of colour represented everywhere. It's the same as regional excellence, like you've said. So that's why we fight for it. I sometimes think people think we're just trying to be really woke or something, or like someone like me is just trying to tick every equality box. But it literally comes down to whether you want this music to continue, whether you want young people especially to actually play and sing beautiful music that we know is important to us now as much as ever.
If it somehow ends up that the only people that care about this music are white and middle class, it's not going to last. It's not going to have relevance, and it's not going to have resonance. And I was thinking about this today as well, that I I struggle to think of any British folk singer who isn't white.
Mm.
Now, I'm really happy to know that there are, to know of people who are transgender, people who are openly gay, bi, and so on.
Yeah,
That's great. That's wonderful. But I do sort of think that we somehow need to have those voices represented, and we need to have a deeper kind of look at why doesn't this appeal? Why is it not working for them or those communities? Or maybe that maybe just try to pay more attention to what they're doing.
Yeah.
and try to incorporate that.
I agree. Yeah, I think things will change. I mean, our cohorts at universities are pretty diverse, and I think it might be that thing of where are we looking, maybe what we think of as folk doesn't have the diversity that actually a lot of things do if we just broaden what the genre can be. Because a flow, as you say, in multiple ways is great. I want to hear more music. It's not that I want different types of people to hear my music. That would be nice too, but actually it's about wanting to hear people's stories. So yeah, it's a tricky one. My feeling is that actually a lot of those conversations are quite uncomfortable for people to have, because we need to acknowledge exactly what I just said, that our music is a colonial entity. I mean, this is maybe a little on the nose, but I definitely had a brilliant time. I was in the Transports production that the Young'uns and Paul Sartin and everyone regenerated, last couple of years, or last year and the year before. I loved that show. Peter Bellamy's wonderful, I mean, actually, in some ways, it worked for me politically, because there you've got a narrative of people who are the absolute arse end of society, and they can't even hang them. They want to go and send them to a colony and breed. No one in the immediacy is the winner there. However, the white people who eventually get sent to Australia and live through it are the winners. So that's a classic example to me of a conversation people don't want to have, that the ending to their story is only a happy ending for the white person. That may well have been something that Bellamy dealt with. I don't know, but when I was doing that show, I was very conscious that people didn't actually really want to have that conversation. And I understand why. They had other conversations. They actually linked that show with refugee narratives rather brilliantly, so that refugee communities would come in to the shows. There would be a to and fro of conversations and stories there, and they would talk while we did the transport show about these British people getting transported. We would then also reflect what the refugee communities who'd come to that town were experiencing, and I thought that was genius. That's a work of diversity, kind of radicalism, isn't it? But it's putting it out there and it's changing it. But the fact is that there's still a narrative there that is, it's not quite accurate, because we weren't I mean, I say we, like my family are Australian, so it feels quite close. We weren't really refugees. The transportation, that particular aspect of criminal justice history is not actually a parallel for refugee identities. We are a colonial entity, and so what we create in those places, like I just said, we are ultimately the winners. Obviously not the poor who died on the ships, not the people who were separated from their families. I know there's hardship, but and that's what check your privilege is, isn't it? It's not saying you didn't have a bad time.
That's right. It's acknowledge. You can acknowledge that you had a really shit life and that things were really hard for you, but you still had white privilege. You were part of a colonial system which allowed you certain benefits that the indigenous peoples did not have. But enslaved peoples did not have.
Your triumphing over those adversities made their lot worse, and that's a horrible thing to hear. We did one transports gig on Australia Day, as it I hope isn't called anymore, but they call it Invasion Day among most people in Australia now. But we did that, and I just felt like I had to say something. So they let me say something after the interview. I just did a little speech to the audience and went, look, I just want to acknowledge that this is the day when Indigenous Australians' lives changed forever for the worst. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. You know, it was like a little, just a little kind of acknowledgement of that people's narrative. But that's not a popular thing. People don't really want to have that conversation. And it is uncomfortable. So maybe that's part of it. And maybe the youth who are coming up, who are maybe not as burdened by those, I don't know, maybe everything's a bit more up in the air. So maybe it is okay to go, that was rubbish, wasn't it? And it's not really moving on in terms of leaving it behind, but it is going, right, what we're going to do that's new. So I'm quite optimistic, really. But I think that's because I spend a lot of my time speaking to young people who love the songs and want to make it work.
Yeah, that's really great. And I'm so happy to hear that there's a diverse group of people interested in that. Because it's, you know, as you say, it's not about diversity for diversity's sake. It's not about, it's not about, oh, can I be more woke than you? And I really hate that.
Yeah.
I really hate that. The way that the media and that certain right-wing figures have corrupted the idea of basic fucking empathy.
Yeah, exactly.
And interest in other people. And also an understanding that we are not, some kind of mysteriously we got to this position as white people. It's just.
I know, that's right. Yeah. But I remember when I did a project called Sweet Liberties in 2015, which was celebrating 800 years since the Magna Carta. And it was part commissioned by the Houses of Parliament, which I don't think is going to happen again for a while. But they commissioned this folk body of work. Martin Joseph was in it, Maz O'Connor. It was so fun. I loved it. And Folk by the Oak, who are, I think, brilliant. I mean, they commissioned some, Lost Words and things like that. Gorgeous.
Yeah, that's amazing.
They do some great stuff. But I remember going into Parliament, to the archives, and to talk to some of the researchers and historians there about this idea, and this is what I'm trying to say, we kind of imbibe this idea that things just keep getting better. We fight for a right, and then we get that right, and everything's lovely for a while. So we move on to that right, and we fight. And these women, they were all women researchers, were all like, that is not how history works. And I don't know where we got this idea that we just sort of keep marching towards everything being perfect. It's like you can lose your rights like that in a puff of smoke. They can just be taken away. And I think, not to be a bit Pollyanna-ish, but I do feel that that's being more explicitly kind of seen by people now, isn't it? We are actually literally seeing things change by the hour in terms of what our constitution and what our rights are. And so that's an interesting thing to remember, that we that we're kind of getting used to a new kind of awareness of fragility, and I think that's going to work its way into how people treat music and the arts as well. It's really grabs.
I'm really glad to hear some optimism, and I think that you're right. There is a future, but we need to stand up and fight for it, and fighting for it means we need to fight for everybody's future. It can't just be for middle-class white people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We have to keep saying it, because I just feel like we don't. It's that thing of, and say it again for the one at the back. But I think we just need to keep saying that, because it's uncomfortable. So we'll unhear it if we're not careful. But you're right, and I think it's a strange resilience that we got from that. Well, I don't know about me. That what other people would have called a sort of post-war kind of solidity of, okay, this is how it is now. I never felt that because of the Cold War, and actually, frankly, because of the way that music was a vessel for people talking about their anxiety. And again, going back to Leon, for me, his defining songs are the songs of the Cold War and of the arms race, which he started writing in the 60s, or maybe even late 50s. And that meant that threat, that feeling that, well, I was born to evaporate, basically. That feeling has a musical voice, and that's Leon for me. And it doesn't make the fear go away, but it does give you, again, a little map for knowing how to deal with it. So music is a vessel for this stuff. Maybe
Definitely.
that's what folk music is now. Maybe we don't need to worry quite so much about the sort of, flat caps and earth boots and all that part of it, and because that's your sort of First World War kind of thinking, isn't it? You're just pre kind of massive industrialization and First World War stuff. But maybe the new folk music is just going, there's a vessel for the things that we're feeling now, and when we talk about it, we call it folk music, you know.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to remember, you know, I absolutely love what Grace Petrie's doing. And the fact is, you know, since the 80s, the LGBT community have struggled through political ignorance, political inaction, political oppression over all kinds of things, from not just about, you know, rights of people being taken away, but the whole AIDS crisis and the way that was handled or not handled, and deliberately mishandled in some cases by our governments, has meant that those people in particular have understood the struggle, they understand the sacrifice, and they understand what it is to actually be part of that. And so this is something that I think we really also why we need to hear these voices, because they've already, you know, they've already been struggling. That it's not like we've all suddenly woken up, oh, we need to struggle. They've been struggling.
You're right. That's that privilege thing again, isn't it? You know, we can say, oh, it's all fine, and it's just great, isn't it, now that this is right? And there's always someone for whom it isn't right, and for whom that is still ongoing. And I think that what I really love is that it kind of doesn't work just with one person. Sometimes, you do get one voice that is so powerful, you go, oh yes, I'll listen to that, and that will. But actually, for the most part, it's a patchwork, isn't it? Because we need to hear and see the people who are in it. But I also think there's a role for the kind of onlookers as well. And I think there's something about the writer that is an outsider by definition, that you are kind of outside looking in, and that you can narrate it. And so those two things are really, really powerful for I guess it's allyship in a way. The writer is the new ally, because the writer has the privilege of rising above it, the hardship, but then you do need the narrator from within that struggle, that authentic voice. And I think between you, it's possible that both of you can be everything. That's what I like about folk music, that even within one song, you sometimes get like you're in there, but then you're the narrator. It's like, this happened to me, and then she says that, and I actually really I think of it as zooming in and zooming out of a story simultaneously, and it's not only folk, but it's something that folk does do, and that those kind of
it does really, really well.
Corinne Polwart as well is great at that. You know, she's got that sort of, it's definitely her and it's her voice, but she also has this sort of slightly ethereal kind of being able to just report and just put that story, or actually really that picture in front of your face for you to go, oh yeah.
She's absolutely wonderful, and the way that she expresses things, and the way that she does put the language together is also something that is just a huge privilege to hear, actually. To hear somebody with that mastery of language express themselves in song, and it's quite incredible.
It's lovely, and it never feels, what I love about it as well is it never makes me feel stupid. You know, there are clever writers and stuff, but you know, it's that thing of going, I get that, I look at that, and that's really clever, because it is clever, and it is high art, I reckon. I mean, I think some of that, you know, lots of writers, but definitely people like Corinne, and Leon does it too, that kind of ability to do those layers, those William Blake-esque layers, where is it a tree, is it a lover, is it the world, is it, I don't know, it's all of those things, and it is kind of high poetry, and it's it's and the music as well. You know, some of the music you get in what people are doing now is so highly kind of realised, isn't it? It really, I don't think anyone can really hang on to that folk music simple thing anymore, because it sometimes is, but it's not really.
Well, we've also, you know, we've been freed from the studio system to a great extent. Anyone can make music on their own in their own bedroom. I mean, almost everything I do is recorded here in this, you know, in these few square feet. And it's mine, and I can do what I want with it, and I can produce it how I want, and I can add what I want or take away what I want. And there's none of this, you have to do it this way.
That's right. That obligation has slightly been removed. That obligation to sort of do a, I don't know, to adhere to some kind of record company sort of aesthetic, or even a record company time scale. That's really interesting now as well, that you can go, I'm going to take a while to make this album, and it's going to be right. And that wasn't always possible before, was it? It's been quite revolutionary, hasn't it? I mean, I don't have resources on hand, but I have this gorgeous little sort of, well, in Sheffield, you know, this amazing little cottage industry of how we all make our music, and how we've got our couple of amazing producers and engineers.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful community there of the people that you've got around you.
Just brilliant.
And I was going to. We're probably getting to. I'm probably taking up too much of your time, but there's some lovely collaborations that you've done. Early on working with Liza Carthy, and then you've worked with Andy Cutting and Martin Simpson, and actually there's a beautiful album, Murmurs, that you produced, which I'd love to talk about, but it'll have to be another time.
Yeah, we should have a Murmurs chat. But that was a lovely album. That was a lovely one to make because it had all of those. It ended up having all of these layers about nature and existence, but that we never really quite planned it like that. It just sort of found its own language, which is really fun. I do love going back and experiencing that. Some of the few songs that I actually listen to back of my own are on Murmurs, so it's nice. But I mean, a lot of that is geographical as well because of Sheffield. Being able to, in the old days, I get on the bus and go to Martin's house because it's on the bus line. So, but that stuff is still continuing because we're able to work remotely as well. It is possible.
That's right. You can share things.
So you can still collaborate, and it's interesting times.
Yeah, and I shouldn't forget to mention, with your obvious long partnership with James Fagan. And is it something that do you write together, or do you write your own stuff very much and then bring it together? Or
no, I write. I mean, he writes instrumentals, but all the songs that we do that are self-written are by me, but I'll write them with his voice in mind. So I wrote a song called I Am the Fox, and James just started singing it. I was like, oh, that's such a James Fagan song. I thought I'd do it. But so and I wrote one called Jerilderie, which is about Ned Kelly, or about a bushranger kind of ghost anyway, for his voice. So that can be quite fun as well, like writing specifically for a voice that really well is really great. But I mean, that duo has made me the performer I am, because we started off as quite a traditional, we mainly did traditional music, and we mainly did English and Irish and Australian, and then we started doing this. Kind of brings it full circle a bit, because I think one of the biggest bodies of work that needs reinterpreting or looking at is colonial sort of Anglo-Australian material, some of which is beautiful and some of which is massively problematic, as you might understand. So it was really interesting when we decided we wanted to sing more songs in James's voice because he's Australian. What we actually ended up doing was singing lots of contemporary songs, or more contemporary songs from Australia. And then I started thinking, oh, well, I might just write some songs then if we're going to do new songs, so I kind of became more of a songwriter as the duo went from traditional, contemporary, and then like writing my own stuff for us. So it's been a great few years.
And now you're passing it on to your children as well, I hear.
Yeah.
I saw some extra guest appearances in some of your Leon Russellson songs, which was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
I mean, I shouldn't be surprised that my kids can sing, but they really can sing.
Yeah.
And it's
absolutely.
It's really interesting. They're good little singers, much better than I was at that age. So they've got great chops. So we'll see.
Brilliant.
We'll see what happens there.
Okay. Nancy, thank you so much for all of your insights and sharing, and it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. You too. It's nice to finally meet you sort of in person. So.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, well, I hope that's worked out for you okay.
Yeah, that's been lovely. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks.